on a spiritual path, we are potentially, at least at some point on our path, especially near the beginning of it, we're potentially trapped between two different worlds. We're potentially trapped between one side of a world, which is the experience of living in the world that we're most familiar with, our human experience. And then the other world that we're learning to step into is this cultivation of deeper awareness of our true self as spirit or consciousness. And so this can lead to parts of us that are likely experiencing more worldly desires and interest. You know, a part of us, our human self, that is more focused on pleasure or money or purpose or success or ambitions, love, relationships, and just the deeper joys of being alive. And then there's also the other part of us that is being drawn to deeper spiritual awareness, that's seeking truth, clarity, freedom, peace, and liberation in some form. And so there are these two parts that kind of live within us. And one of the challenges that sometimes arises in this context is that we can perceive these two coexisting desires in opposition of each other. And this can lead to an inner conflict where we might feel that we need to choose one focus of the two, that we might have just one option where we can either choose to enjoy the world, increase abundance, pleasure, and success, or we can choose the path that awakens our deepest true self. And so intellectually, many experience seekers will recognize that there doesn't need to be this conflict, that there's really not a conflict. But we still have to navigate the process of some of the subtle conflicts that may happen, because there are oftentimes subtle or not so subtle belief systems that can remain, where we might experience or imagine a conflict between spirituality and money, wealth, and abundance, for instance, or between spirituality and pleasure and sensuality or sexuality, or between serving a purpose that benefits others versus serving a purpose that benefits us personally or for our worldly success, or between specific aspirations and whether they fit into an ideal of spiritual behavior or outcomes, or between spiritual ideals and potential judgments of our own ego's desires. And so all of these potential conflicts can arise within our experience. And so these conflicts can cause us to feel sometimes that we may need to appear more spiritual or hide parts of our human selves, in which case we may create feelings of an inner conflict or hypocrisy as we're navigating this process. And so these inner conflicts can create confusion about what to focus on, can cause us to repress desires, feelings, opportunities for higher potential in the world, can create feelings of guilt or shame for our natural human desires that we may judge as ego or less than spiritual. And that can cause us to feel enjoying the world as some sort of failing on the spiritual path. And it may also cause us to deny or minimize our deeper desires, our passions, or our goals. And we may feel we need to pretend something isn't really important to us because we think it's not spiritual. We may even set aside deeper ambitions and accomplishments, thinking that they're distractions on our spiritual path. So in our attempt to navigate and correct these inner conflicts and experiences, our first attempts especially often miss the mark a little bit as we try to address it from the experience of the conflict itself. And so sometimes some of the mistakes that we might make as we're initially trying to weave these two worlds together or figure out what to focus on or navigate the experience of that inner conflict is, on one hand, we might just focus only on our human life while ignoring our more authentic spiritual growth. And so this can include, claiming that pursuing spiritual or personal desires alone is spiritual, that attempting to integrate and accept our worldly desires by polarizing them as spiritual and believing that our worldly enjoyment makes us spiritually special or advanced. So some examples of this that exist are declaring that sexual energy and power is more spiritual than anything else, for instance, or declaring that our financial abundance is a reflection of our love for God. So those are some examples of how that may play out sometimes for people. And then also there are, teachings that are connected to and based upon spiritual principles, such as using manifestation or law of attraction kinds of teachings, which do have some essence of benefit to them. I will say that in advance. But there also are ways of engaging those practices where where the teachings, or at least the implementation of those teachings, can be really just focused on chasing our human desires. And when we use it that way, it does strengthen our ego and our karmic attachments, and it can become a distraction from spiritual growth. Because if we're using these methods to attempt to force our will and our desires into existence, where we're thinking of it almost like a universal, cosmic Santa Claus that's just supposed to be giving us the things that we want, the gifts that we want, then we are also mistaking our place in this process and believing that we're in full control of it. Believing that failing or not doing it right if we don't get the results that we're expecting, that there's sort of this magical thinking. I can at least remember in my early days, many, many years ago, of sort of learning about The Secret and law of attraction, and having this idea within me that my thoughts created my reality, and therefore every time things went wrong or something failed or I didn't get what I was trying to accomplish, I beat myself up thinking that I had made a mistake, that I had somehow done the wrong thing, that I was at fault. And so we can get caught in some of these kinds of traps and loops in the process of doing that. And so this is also about being dishonest with oneself sometimes too, because if we label our manifestation or our law of attraction as a spiritual practice, when our only real goal is to try to fulfill our human desires, to get the $1 million mansion and a new car and those kinds of things. Not that there's anything wrong with $1 million mansions or cars, but it's about the self-awareness of the intention that we're setting for ourselves. And so the other side, of course, is that we might focus on our spiritual practices and ignore our human desires and enjoyments altogether. That's also something that happens as the flip side of this, and when it's polarized. And so in that context, we might deny or repress our human desires and pleasures. We might feel guilty about our human experiences and our needs. We might reject money and think that we just need to live with simplicity because it's more spiritual, when in fact we aren't actually giving ourselves enough money to be able to have a comfortable life. So there's potential mistakes that can be made when we polarize to both sides. So to be clear, abundance, worldly success, and sexuality are and can be experienced as spiritual in nature. They are spiritual. So the issue isn't believing that they're spiritual. The potential issue is attempting to elevate them as being more spiritual than other elements of our experience, or making them uniquely special or more spiritual than other experiences in life. And so they can serve as powerful tools and opportunities for growth on the spiritual path, but an attachment to them as being spiritually special can become a distraction. And so that's the caution. Not in the enjoyment of them and discovering them in their spirituality or their sacredness. So instead, what we want to do is to find a harmonious, integral way to seamlessly weave a fully joyful, fulfilling worldly experience into an authentic spiritual path. So we want to be able to experience both of these pursuits, our human enjoyments and passions, and our spiritual path, as an integral process of transformation and spiritual awakening. To heal our shame and resistance to worldly pleasures, success, and abundance, while also becoming free to enjoy them instead of more attached to them. And to be fully honest with our deeper desires, hopes, dreams, and find ways to consciously step into them in service of our spiritual path. So when we approach it that way, we're able to create a conscious pursuit of our human enjoyments, pleasures, goals, and pursuits of success, and allow them to become fuel for personal transformation and spiritual growth. We learn how to turn any and every experience that we have into spiritual practice. And we release limitations and self-imposed judgments and become more free, both as human and within our spiritual awareness. Our conscious experience of worldly enjoyment leads us to freedom and away from attachment when we get this balance right. And we come to enjoy all that life has to offer more deeply and more fully, while also discovering that our true happiness, joy, bliss, and our deeper abundance actually arise from within our true self. They are not something that we grasp and attain from the outer world, but they actually are reflections of our deeper true nature in its fullness and its joy. And so we come to experience more flow and peace within the experience of life. We enhance and support deeper spiritual growth. We clear and release those inner conflicts, the shame, the guilt that we may have, and find deeper self-acceptance and self-love. And we step more fully into a life that reflects and aligns with our higher spiritual potential and the awakening of our true self. When we get that balance right, we can experience all those things. And so the core idea here is that from the tantric perspective, the teachings, they approach this in telling us that everything is a manifestation and expression of divine consciousness. So in that statement, it is true that everything is spiritual, everything is sacred. That includes sexuality, that includes abundance, that includes, money and success and all those kinds of things. But it doesn't say that one thing is more sacred or special than the other. That's the part that we have to remember, that even things that we normally would find disgusting are technically also still part of that sacred web, but we don't usually run around, being really happy about things that are disgusting. So this becomes part of the balance, is like we have to be able to keep in mind that it's sacred because everything is sacred, not because we're singling out some specific experience in our human life and saying that this is more special. Now, celebrating its sacredness as part of integrating it into our whole, of course, can be helpful. If we've had shame around our sexuality, for instance, then yes, elevating it to something that is spiritual and sacred can be very helpful, empowering, and healing. But we want to keep in mind that we're weaving it into the totality of sacredness, not making it something special or justifying our behavior really just to pursue our human desires. So therefore, every experience we have is sacred and spiritual in nature. But this has to be experienced. We can't just mentally declare that it's sacred. It's not enough to say that money, pleasure, or sexuality is sacred or spiritual unless we actually shift our experience relationship with it.